My grieving friends, I am so thrilled to say welcome to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. And today, I've been waiting for this conversation for a long time. We have Dr. Joe Cacciatore here with us today, author of Bearing the Unbearable, Audible series, a great course, Understanding and Coping with Grief. You probably all already know her, so I'm just thrilled to be in your company and welcome you to the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm honored to be here and talk about the hardest thing to talk about, right?
Right? It's the hardest. And yet, I think we both share this mission very much of really pushing back against the cultural problematic stories that we have around grief and recognizing the unnecessary harm that those stories have. And so I'm always so delighted to be in the company of somebody who is also on this mission to really shift it. And as I think we'll hopefully touch on today, actually discover that when we turn towards the hard things, when we're with the grief, which I want to talk with you about your ideas around that, that's actually where beauty can be found and love can be found, right?
Yeah. And I think in part, the reason it's so hard to talk about is society's so resistant to it, right?
Exactly.
I mean, grieving people are usually wanting to talk about not just their dead person who died, but also the way they're feeling about it, the way they're missing him or her, them, and the way they're longing for him or her, them. And society tells us that around every corner, shut it down, don't talk about it, move on, feel better. All the
toxic positivity, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of lingo. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's why we're going to dive in. That's why I've spent these past 5 seasons diving into this conversation. And, you know, I want to ground us, speaking of sort of where do we learn these grief beliefs that can cause us harm? I want to ground us in this question, this sort of sustained meditation I've had with every guest over these past, well, we're now in season 6, so 6 seasons, which is asking you to reflect back on an earliest memory of loss, maybe in your childhood or young adulthood. And how were the adults around you modeling grief, meaning showing you behaviorally, explicitly, implicitly? And what do you think that taught you back then about what grief, and I'm going to use air quotes here, people should or shouldn't look or feel like? Can you think of an early memory?
Well, my earliest memory of loss is my daughter. I mean, she was my first loss experience. So she's the first. I mean, I lost grandparents, but I wasn't close to them and I didn't have a grief reaction. I was sad for my parents and their feelings, but I wasn't close to them. So I didn't feel any kind of sadness for me. So really my first experience with loss was Shai's death.
Wow.
Okay. And the way people behaved around me back in 94 was less than I would have wished for. There was a lot of experiential avoidance, a lot of unconscious avoidance, lots of prodding me to move on, time to put it behind you, time to heal, time to choose healing. There was a lot of that from many
lingo. Focus on your other kids, because I know you had
lots of
3 other children, I think, when Shai passed.
Yeah, we did, yeah, lots of that, lots of intimations to leave her in the past, and thus leave my grief in the past, and by default, thus leave my love in the past. And I wasn't willing to do that.
Yeah.
And I wasn't willing to pretend she didn't exist. And so, of course, there was a lot of tension between me and the space between others.
Yes.
And so it was a lot of figuring things out on my own, because back in 94, we didn't have the internet.
No. We didn't have the canon of grief books that we have. We didn't have the internet. Yeah.
No, we didn't really have anything. I mean, I had to go to the ASU library when I was in early grief and read old journal articles, the very few handful of studies that I could find on traumatic bereavement. And it helped me a little bit understand that I wasn't crazy, that other people felt the same way, because, before the internet, it was hard to connect to groups of people.
Yeah.
So
even now with the internet, I think listeners can attest that you feel crazy, even in the sea of community that we, I think, are building. But So to imagine this version of you as a young mom who's lost a child, had a child died, and this traumatic grief experience, and not be able to step outside your door, literally or digitally. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It was a lot. the messages were, I mean, I guess there was a small, still voice inside me that rejected it all. You know, I went
Yeah.
to several counselors, several therapists, you know, at the behest of people around me who thought I wasn't okay. The reality is I didn't need counseling. They all needed counseling. What I was feeling was completely normal and appropriate given the tragedy that I had just gone through. This sort of machinations of dance around grief and loss and the aspects of trauma were really a dysfunction of people around me, that they couldn't cope
Yes.
with it and they couldn't bear to see me in such deep pain. Well, that's their problem, not my problem. And there was a small, still, wise voice, even at the early age there was a small, still, wise voice that was like, you know, your love is worth every tear. You know, this is righteous grief. It's okay to feel what you feel. And thankfully I had that small, still voice, because I don't know if I would be where I am today. I don't know if I would have done the things that I've been able to do because I had created space to truly be with my grief.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things that I want to dive into, including some of the things, the incredible work that you've grown, as a result of this. But just to get a little more curious about, there's something you said there, which was you were young. Remind me, how
Yeah.
old were you when
29.
you were 29? You had these 3 other kids. You had Shai. She passed in this traumatic, tragic way. Looking back at 29-year-old Dr. Joe, I mean, maybe you weren't even Dr. Joe
I
then,
was
right?
not
You were
Dr.
just
Joe.
Joe, right? Yeah.
I
But
was
so
mom.
looking back at that version of you and thinking about all the listeners who were listening to the show, can you think about what was that still voice? What did it sound like? What did it feel like? If you could invite listeners to try to practice tuning in, how did you recognize what that?
Well, my first instinct is that I remember that it felt ancient, for lack of a better word. It felt
Yes.
beyond time and space. And it just felt very wise. It felt like something bigger than me. I was a big fan, and still am, of Carl Sagan, the physicist. I
Yes.
mean, when he would talk about time and space and universes and black holes, I remember thinking that's where this voice is resonating from somewhere far beyond the context of the material world, ethereal, spiritual, perhaps / existential for those who aren't spiritually inclined.
Yeah.
But it felt like an ancient wisdom of truth. And I would rely on that a lot because there was a lot of self-questioning. I mean, there's something when 5 people are around you going, honey, you need to move on. Honey, you
Right.
need to feel better. Honey, you need to stop dwelling in the past. When there were all those voices around me, there was a real pull to abandon that wise voice,
Yeah.
that inner knowing. And I was just really conscious of that even at a young age, even before I'd started a meditation practice, before I'd started my own sort of formal practice. There was something in me that just knew, kind of like, I've been vegan since I was a little girl. And it was like that. It was like there was something in me, like I knew I didn't want to contribute to the harming of animals.
Yes.
And it didn't come from outside me. It came from inside me. And it was just this sort of knowing that this is in alignment with who I am and the mores that I wanted to bring forward in the world. And so it was like that. It was like this. It didn't come from my family of origin. They ate 5 different kinds of meat for every meal,
Right.
and honestly, as it came to grief, they were avoidant. They were really avoidant.
They were part of this cultural
absolutely
theme. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, they were, I come from an immigrant family and there was a lot of intergenerational trauma. My mother is the namesake of her 2 dead siblings, and so I come from this, and no one ever spoke of those 2 dead siblings. I didn't even know about those 2 dead siblings until I was an adult and after Cheyenne died. So I came from a family system that was very different from the way I decided to live my life. So it's interesting. I don't really know what it is, except it feels ancient, and in a Saganish way, it feels beyond time and space.
I absolutely love that answer. Thank you so much, and resonate with that so much. And part of why I wanted to sort of tease that out or invite you to share a little more with your listeners is I've said for years now that I really do believe that we have an intuition. We have an intuitive way of grieving. And we've, through lots of reasons of modernity and Western culture and capitalism, all the things that, we're surrounded by, has slowly chipped away at our tuning in to that inner knowing in lots of domains, not just in grief, but certainly in grief.
Yeah.
And so much of our suffering, as I say often, my listeners will know that I've said this so many times before, but I hope bears repeating, is that to me, and I think you touch on this in some ways so beautifully in your book, is that our suffering in grief, although I do believe suffering serves its purpose, and I want to dig into that too, but so much of our unnecessary suffering grief is in that gap between what we intuitively know about how to be with our grief and the pressures from the external world about how we, should be in our grief, right?
Yeah.
That's that gulf.
Yeah. And there's studies that back that up. For example, Vanessa Juth conducted a study with colleagues that showed that social constraints, the ways in which our social system pushes us toward feeling better or forgetting and moving on, was the greatest predictor in poor psychological and physiological health outcomes in bereavement. Right. So this is not just sort of this mystical
woo-woo,
hypothesis. I mean, there's science behind this, and that's not the only study. We show it repeatedly. Pennebaker showed it in early studies in the 90s and 80s. I mean, there's research out there that goes back decades that shows that. And so it's very interesting to observe if you can kind of get outside yourself and just notice what's happening in the social spaces between grievers and those who are not currently grieving, actively grieving.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much for bringing that science. And folks, I'm going to drop some of that stuff in the show notes as well. And I know you dig into that, and you referenced something that I was, again, nodding my head, sticky notes. When you're watching on YouTube or checking out a reel, you'll see my book is, color coded, was something that you just said there, which is part of the reason it's so important for us to tune into our intuitive knowing about our grief, is that grief is not just emotional, it's cognitive and physical and spiritual and relational and of course economic and all the things. So much harm can come when we're not attending to all of the sort of impacts.
That's right.
Of our grief, which is one of the many things that I love so much. I want to dive in and have you kind of tease out and pull out some of the extraordinary themes that you explore in this book so beautifully, with your own lived experience, with the lived experience of those people that you've accompanied over the years. And again, something I think we share so much really is our perspective on that it's not our job to show up and fix, and that it's our job to accompany alongside folks.
That's right.
But can you, so you weren't Dr. Joe when you experienced this first profound loss. You were Mom and Joe. Yeah. So, I mean, people can read your bio and they heard it at the top of the show, but when you think about from that traumatically grieving mom to what you're doing in the world, how would you describe the sort of holistic or trajectory of the way you're transforming that and putting your own wisdom back into the world? I mean, you've written books, you've written podcasts, you've worked with, I know, Oprah and Harry on the mental health, but how do you think about that transformation?
I mean, I see the world a lot in images and metaphors, and I have seen sort of the way I see myself as sort of my knees are bloodied and my elbows are bloodied, and from those bloodied knees and elbows grow these amazing, beautiful flowers. And to me, the flowers are her in the world, right? Yes. All of our dead, we bring them forward with us when we help someone else. We bring them forward with us when we show kindness. We bring them forward with us when we're compassionate toward all beings. We bring them forward with us when we sometimes have to be fierce in the world to protect someone who can't protect themselves. And so for me, I guess, first of all, I have to say that whatever good has come from her death hasn't been worth the price.
No, of course. Thank you for naming that. We don't have to be, it happened for a reason, BS. No.
Yeah, no, that's nonsense. And I would give it all back in a second, as much as I love what we do and the power of what we do. I selfishly would give it back to have my child.
Yes.
Having said that, I have no option except to choose what I'm going to do with it. Yes. And allowing it to transfigure me. The thing is, because in the West, we have no patience. We don't want to wait. And T.S. Eliot said, wait without hope, because it would be hope for the wrong thing. And the idea is, which is what I practiced, just being with grief, allowing grief to be what it was, to take me into the abyss, to twist me and turn me about, turn me inside out, spit me out, pull me back in, over and over, iteration after iteration after iteration.
The riptide pulling you back into the waves
over
and
and
ocean.
over and over. And it was only through being with grief in that way was I able to be fully transfigured into bringing to the world what I've been able to bring to the world, which is a small drop of what needs to be brought to the world. So I suppose that's the long answer to your question.
No, it's beautiful. Yeah.
It's hard for me to answer in, these pithy sort of, because it's so complex, isn't it?
It's so complex. You've experienced so much personally. You've created so much in the wake of this, and you've worked with so many people in so many formats. And so, first of all, everything you've said so far to me, as far as I can tell, is sort of poetry in motion. So don't worry about the pithy, and we have plenty of time to explore. I'm not in a hurry, right? I'm very patient. And so, but I think one of the many pages that I tagged in the book, and one of the themes that I was hoping we could dive in to and gift this to our listeners to think about, is what you just named, which was being with grief. I've said this so long for over the years. So I just passed the 13th anniversary of my husband's death, and just passed the 10th anniversary of my friend Joe's death. Joe's here in the room with us too. Eric and Joe are here, and I had to learn myself. I can't claim that I listened to my intuitive voice quite as quickly as you did, but certainly early. And I have been practicing myself, and in all the work that I've done as a social worker and now as a grief activist, and in all the work that I do, this notion that you talked about, being with. And yet I'd love for you to tease it out, because I think people say that a lot, turn towards your grief, be with your grief. And so many people, because of the guttural fear, maybe because of the trauma, because of the culture, A, don't feel they have the courage to do it, and B, don't know the components that it takes. And I love how you sort of break down in Bearing the Unbearable, and I'm sure in your other work, the components of self-awareness and, emotional transparency and self-compassion. Yeah. Can you talk us through a little bit, what does it mean to be with your grief, and how might that look even? Maybe give us an example of what that might look like.
Right. So in the important thing, the book is broken up into being with grief, surrendering to grief, and doing with grief.
Yes.
The important thing is that it's always in movement.
Right. So it's not a stages,
You are definitely not done. I mean, so I'll give you an example. This summer, I hiked 176 miles. I took time off. I could feel grief. So it was the 30th anniversary of Cheyenne's death. Yeah. Okay. And I had a feeling it was going to be tough. And then the first hot day, she died July 27th. And so the first hot day of every summer, it's like it's cellular memory, cellular dysphoria.
Yes.
Your body remembers. It sure does. And so every year, the first hot day, I'm like, oh, it's coming. Her day is coming. But this year was 30 years. And that to me feels really big, like really big. So how did I make it 30 years? This is a long time. So I knew I was going to have to pull my energy in. And really that's about being with grief, is pulling the energy in. And it's a self-focus, and not in a selfish or narcissistic way. It's in a way of self-care. Like, I'm going to pull my energy in, and I'm going to spend some time with my beloved dead. And so I knew I wanted time with her, and the best place for me to find time with her really is at the care farm. But I can't not work when I'm here, because there's constantly a flow of people. So I knew I had to leave. And so I left and hiked 176 miles on the Colorado Trail. And it was intentional. And I brought her with me in my heart, in my mind. I cried. I took my shoes off. I walked barefoot part of the time. I pulled my energy in. I turned my phone off. I said, do not call me. I need time with my child alone, not being interfered. And I did all the practices that I know for me create space in my mind and in my heart. So I'm not pulled away by thinking about the grant or the research paper, or extrapolating data or dinner or anything. I just wanted time to be with her and think about her and reflect on her and cry and miss her and feel whatever comes forward. And sometimes what came forward was painful and trauma laden. And sometimes in those weeks I was on the trail, and sometimes what came forward was beauty. Sometimes it was a kind of tragic beauty where, I hiked to Island Lake in Colorado. If anybody has ever been there, it's incredible beauty. And I came over the peak and I dropped down into this valley, and there was this alpine stream, and it was just so beautiful. And I cried because it was beautiful, and also she was missing it, and she would never get to see it in the way that I wished she could see it. And so I imagined her there, and I cried, and that's okay. Like, I make space for whatever's there, like the beauty and the pain and the joy and the grief, and sometimes the anger or the guilt, and the sense of connection to her. And I just let whatever it is come forward, and I let it be there. I don't push it away. I don't hold on to it, but I don't push it away. And I think that's one of the most important things about trusting ourselves with all of the emotions that are associated with our grief, is being able to just make space for it and not prematurely detach from those emotions.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's an example of how I, 30 years later, made space to be with grief. And then, surrendering to grief, for me, like at this point now, it's a little bit surrendering to grief because I'm back at the care farm. I'm being pulled back into the world, the busy world. And that means I have to intentionally set aside time for grief. Otherwise, I'd work 17 hours a day and wouldn't have a break. So, in my quiet time, my contemplative time, in my time sitting with one of the horses, I allow grief to come, but I intentionally turn toward it and allow myself to feel it, even in interacting with others, using my own pain, not as the focus, but as a bridge.
Yes.
To connect with the pain and the suffering of another. And when that's true, whether it's another human or another animal who's been abused or tortured, as we have on the farm.
Yeah. Well, that's so beautiful. And I do want to dive in a little bit to what you're doing at the care farm, but just to reflect back what you said, and just sort of to turn my gaze out towards the audience and invite people in to hear. There's so much richness about what you offered, and you offered us this almost like this ritual that you created, this sort of this hike. And I just want to name that all of us can do that. You may or may not be able to hike 176 miles. I'm not sure that I'm physically capable of doing that, although I aspire. But as to your point, that's actually not necessary. It's about the permission giving.
That's right.
And it's about the sort of way in which you set up your space. That can be by letting other people know, by turning off your phone, etc. And I think most importantly, with self-compassion.
Yeah.
And self-awareness, turning towards without force, whatever is coming up. And I love that metaphor. I've been thinking lately, I've been saying this a few times when I've been interviewing people, kind of having a loose grip on the emotions, not too tight and not pushing away, but just allowing them to filter through, because the water, it will pass.
Yeah.
Then that's the thing I always remind people when we think about being with our grief. And I've been there. I think maybe you have too, where I thought, if I open up right now, I'm never going to stop. Like if the tears, I've had days where I thought, if I start now, but the thing is, no emotion in the history of your life has ever lasted. Not the ones you wanted, and not the ones you didn't want. And I think you talk about this in the book too, in this, you said, by allowing the deep grief and the sorrow and the sadness and maybe the anguish to come, you also open the door
to other things,
joy, delight, or even this tragic beauty concept, which I think is so important.
Well, you let the bottom drop out, right? The top comes up and you have expansion. You pull the bottom up forcibly, you forcibly bring the top down, and then you have a contraction, right?
That contraction expansion metaphor is so important.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as you were speaking, I was thinking about, sort of the truth of this idea that for example, in the mindfulness community, you've often heard people use mindfulness as a weapon, unfortunately, in the West against
Yes.
grievers. And they say, well, you have to let it go. And I really don't like that. I'm very picky about language. And I say, you don't have to let anything go, but I encourage you to allow it to move when it's ready to move.
Yes.
Because allowing it to move means it moves, but it might move and come back around. And almost always grief and its accompanying or corollary emotions will always come back around. If it's a catastrophic loss, especially for you, Eric and Joe, for me, Cheyenne, those emotions 30 years later are still as potent as they were. It's just, I'm stronger now and can carry it. I've built emotional muscle. And so when it comes and it asks to be seen, moves from the background to the foreground. I go, oh yeah, I know you. I've done this a lot of times. Okay. I can handle it. I trust myself with it. And that's an incredible gift that we give ourselves in being with grief. And the practice of being with grief is self-trust and trust of our emotions and our grief. It's powerful.
So powerful. And I'm so glad you brought up that sort of way in which we, in the way only the West, I feel, is so capable of doing it, is like we've monetized and we compartmentalized this broad idea of mindfulness and then turned it into a let it go because we got to move on and make money, right? Kind of concept.
Sure. I mean, Jeffrey Rubin calls it McMindfulness.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So, and I appreciate though that allowing it to move through. Yeah. And sometimes I think about it as metabolizing. We're always metabolizing our grief. And I think that's just so beautiful. I think you talk in the book in a way, I don't know if you use this language, but I was looking at my notes, I was thinking about on this theme of that grief will come around in different ways. You say that we're in a relationship with grief, basically, is one way to think about it. But in particular, can you talk a little bit more about, there's so much pressure in that letting go that the grief is just going to get smaller and go away, right? But you spend so much time so beautifully articulating this vision of the grief stays the same. It's the musculature, as you just alluded to, or the emotional musculature. We just get better at carrying it, right, and coping in a way, right? Not in a way of bypassing, but coping and building your emotional musculature is the way forward with grief. Can you help us a little what does that emotional musculature require of us?
Well, I mean, we have to build it. Right. The same way if you aspire to be a piano player, but you never practice playing piano, you're probably not going to play the piano. Happen. Right? It requires practice. The same way that if you want to be able to eventually, lift 80 pounds from a bench, a barbell, if you don't practice starting with 10 pounds, you'll never make it to 80. And that's the thing, is that over time, as we practice with it, we build up the muscle.
Disconnected.
That was odd. Excuse us, everybody. There was a random music that just popped in somewhere. I don't know where that came from.
I don't know where it came from. I've never heard that song.
I've never heard that either. That's so funny. Okay. Well, hopefully that won't come back, and we might just leave this in because that was just a funny little bit. But you're talking a little bit about,
is that music Eric might have liked?
No, I don't either, because it sounded country, which is not particularly my jam. No offense to the country music listeners out there, but that was a little something.
It was interesting.
That was, somebody showed up there. But I appreciate you oh boy, giggles now for here. But I loved that metaphor of the musculature and the carrying. And it kind of goes back to your patients. And again, just to the listener who feels like, I don't want to spend the time building the muscle. I just want to be able to carry it, right? I get you. We see you. I think we've all been there in that grief in those early training days where we were exhausted by it.
Oh, yes.
Right. And it can be, so you can be laid low, which is why you need to give yourself that space and time. But that musculature, the thing is, just like when you go to the gym and you come home the first day, you don't see new, you're not like,
no.
And that's
the next day you're really sore.
And you're really sore and it hurts worse. And you think, why did I?
And you're like, I'm never doing that again. Right.
Right.
But
that's such an important metaphor.
Right. If you never do it again, you can never do it again. And that's key. I mean, that's habituation, right?
Yes.
We habituate to something by practicing with it, and we get better at it, not just at building the muscle, but also the sort of the strategies like balancing it, like you would be carrying, a basket of fruit on your head, and it's of course you're strengthening. You have to have strong shoulder muscles and neck muscles, but also there has to be balance and some strategy to it, right? And so it's the same thing. It's we're learning how to take this forward with us into the world, and in order to do so, we need to strengthen the literally strengthen the physical form. So self-care, I'm big thing we do here is psychoeducation around self-care. Eat clean, play dirty, sweat, get sunshine,
sleep,
get plenty of good sleep, feel socially connected, all the things, take a good, food-based multi, all the things, right? Drink water. So physical body, this vessel has to carry all of this emotion. And we can do so when we're physically, it's easier to do so when we're physically stronger. Everyone knows that when you're not feeling well, it's much harder to feel your emotions because you're so exhausted from feeling unwell. But then there's this sort of metaphysical or spiritual existential self-strengthening that we do. And that helps us boost the self-trust and the capacity to bear it and cope with it. And that is a gift that will last a lifetime. Like, I have practiced so much with my grief and carrying my grief and how to carry my grief and all that. I've practiced so much over the last 30 years that I kind of trust myself with anything. Maybe I trust myself too much. I'm like, there's nothing I can't handle. There's plenty I don't want to handle. I could make a long list.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's nothing I feel I couldn't handle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I hear there are probably people listening who are like, this is wrong. I don't want to have to do this. Yes.
I don't want to have to handle it. I wish you didn't have to.
We both do. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Especially with catastrophic loss. It's not something anyone should have to go through. And yet here we are.
Yeah,
right?
Here we are. You said something there that's really important. And I find myself saying a version of this to folks all the time when I'm working with them, and have to remind myself that too, is that each time you lift the weight, each time you turn towards, you are with your heart emotions. And even if you have that sort of emotion hangover the next day, or the sore, emotional muscles, each time you do it, and then you're able to sort of return to the world, you're building the self-trust. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so important. Can you say more about that self-trust? Because part of what we lose is our identity and our trust in ourselves, in the world. That we have this existential crisis. Why do bad things happen to good people?
Right.
So can you talk about the self-trust that we build as we practice being with our grief?
Yeah, sure. It's exactly what you said. So you go to the gym and you work out really hard and you're really tired, and the next day you're really sore and you're thinking, oh, this is too much. This routine, whatever that my trainers got me on is too much. They're asking too much of me. And then you give yourself a bit of a break, and then you return to some level of homeostasis that's tolerable. Yeah. And then you go, okay, I'm going to go back and work out again. And then you go back to the gym. And at some point, it gets to where, oh, it's still just as hard, but I'm stronger and I can do this.
Yeah, we start to reclaim our agency, maybe, or our capacity, which again are the things. So many of the practices, even though it seems hard to turn towards and be with, is we are reclaiming so much of what we lost in that death loss. Although this applies, I have guests on the show talking about grief, of course, and related to non-death losses. But so much of what we experience in profound losses is that sense of self-trust, that sense of agencies, that sense of our own capacity. Yeah. And each time we do it, again, early on, it's not going to feel like you're just putting in the reps and you're not feeling it. But we are gaining that so that we can breathe a little easier, knowing that when that next wave comes, because we will be in a relationship with grief for a profound loss for the rest of our lives, that we have the capacity, even if we don't want to endure it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's bearing the unbearable, isn't it?
It's bearing the unbearable. Exactly.
Right.
Perfection.
And that's the name of the book. So, I mean, I think as I'm thinking through this metaphor, and as I'm thinking through sort of how we move through grief and we carry it forward with us and we build the muscle and we start to trust ourselves, and we're always sort of going out into the world and testing a little bit. I think what we find is as we build that muscle, in yoga, they talk about, you strike me as someone who might know a little bit about yoga. So yes. In yoga, we talk about strong back, soft belly. And I think that's one of the great things that this practice gives you, is so that you're not just soft belly, but you've also cultivated some strong back, so that when you go out into social spaces, so it helps us carry this load, but it also helps us carry the load of the between spaces. Okay.
Yes.
So when I go out, the strengthening me, this psychological and physical strengthening practice, when I go out into the world then, and someone says to me, well, at least it was the baby who died and not your older child, I can say, I'm sure you mean well. And I just also want to share that isn't my truth, and that it would hurt me to lose any of my children. I love them all the same. And I can say that with a strong back. That's my strong back, but a soft belly. And that practice is incredibly helpful for people in social spaces because, as you know, I'm sure, people say some really awful things to grieving people, really shockingly awful things to grieving people that make my mouth drop to the floor every day. And I go, what? Yes. It doesn't even make sense. And so, I don't feel like it should be the responsibility of vulnerable people to educate others on their experience and being sensitive to their experience. However, I found it helpful to not just swallow it or walk away.
Yeah.
I found it for me helpful to say, that's not my truth. I know you mean well, but that's not my truth.
Yeah. I love that. I love the way you say that. And I'm certainly going to borrow that. I can imagine our listeners are too. And I love that you've brought the strong back, soft belly metaphor into how we approach grief. I love that. I do know that because one of the chapters in my book, "And Grief is a Sneaky Bitch," is called "People Say Stupid Shit." It's not a whole book worth of swearing, but I know that because as I was taking my 44-year-old husband off life support in the hospital, a friend of his came up to me and said, "At least he'll be in a better place soon. And don't worry, you're young, you'll find love again." Within 2 days of him dying, right? So I know people say stupid shit. And so I also have a chapter called "Why Going Places and Seeing People is Exhausting in Grief."
Yeah.
Because to your point, I sort of offer up this idea of thinking of, like, we have three options when someone says something harmful, hurtful to us from their own grief avoidance, their own grief illiteracy. We can educate them, to your point. We can tell them off, although I don't particularly encourage that, depending. Or we can ignore them, because if it's not somebody that we meaningfully want to be in our lives, maybe it's not worth the energy for us to do that education, right? Yeah. But for those people who we think they're in our lives, you think maybe they mean well, you're gonna be crossing paths again. As you said, I hate to put the burden on the griever, and yet
here we are.
It's a gift we can both give to them. But if you don't want to feel generous, it's actually a gift you're giving to yourself. Because first of all, when you say it, you're reminding and affirming yourself that to be true.
Right.
And also you're helping, hopefully, so that next time they show up in your lives, they will be more thoughtful. And by the way, the ripple effect to all the other people that they might have said that thing to.
Sure. Yeah. They'll mow somebody else over with that. I mean, I think for me, I found it empowering to be able to say, even to sometimes strangers, I know you mean well, but that's not my truth. Yeah, you're right. There are days I didn't have the energy for it. I'm like, whatever. Just
keep moving.
STFU, man.
Yeah,
Whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
But for the most part, I felt really empowered to say that's not my truth. And it always surprises me the way that people responded and respond. Even today, I do that with people, because even today people say things like, oh gosh, I didn't know you lost a child. Well, but look at all the good you're bringing to the world. And I say, yeah, that's actually not my truth. But what is my truth is that whatever good happens in the world because of her is because I've chosen to remember her and to honor her this way. Exactly. But I would give it back in a minute if I could. And that's my truth. And I've had people go, I've had some people thank me. Some people have been sort of just taken aback and maybe offended. I don't care.
That's a them problem.
That's right. Yeah. I'm right there with you, Lisa.
Yeah.
That is a them problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. And I love, again, I think that response that you were just explaining, I think that so many of us got, especially those of us who have done work in the world, such as the work that we're doing, is that people try to close it into a very neat little package, like, well, aren't you grateful? And this is what you do. And, you know, and I think I'm always, and is my favorite word. It's part of this beautiful memorial tattoo I have on my arm. And I'm always trying to expand into the and, right? And to say, like, yes, this thing happened and I'm choosing
Yeah.
to do this. And it's actually because I turn towards
Yeah.
my grief and because I carry Cheyenne with me all
Yeah.
these years later.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and
Yeah,
that's what I say. I've been saying for 30 years, whatever good comes from this is not in spite of grief. It's because of grief.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That this isn't a way of trying to, like, you know, shut down. And you
Right.
talk about in the book, you know, bypassing our grief. This is one of the many places in the book where I was like, yes, I can't wait to be in conversation with you. You talked about bypassing grief as being really one of our biggest threats.
Yeah.
Not just to us individually, which I think we've touched on a little bit, you know, in the ways that if we bypass our grief, then we actually don't get to also have access to, you know, the beauty that is still in life, but also sort of raising that up to having the lens on the sort of cultural, societal impact that,
And intergenerational.
and the intergener. I mean, I come from my dad is a Holocaust survivor on that side of, you know, I come from intergenerational trauma myself, but also, so the intergenerational, but also then how that denial or bypassing of grief has shown up in the world in violence, in terror, in trauma, in,
Yep. Yeah. In a bizarrely Nietzschean way, when we bypass it, we actually bring it forward unconsciously, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
And Nietzsche warned
exactly.
us about that. So,
Yeah. And I think that causing of that, you sort of carry that wound and then inflict that wound on the world as a way of not attending to it. You know, we're, we're moving towards the third quarter, towards the end of our conversation today. I hope this will be the beginning of many conversations we might have, but I'm recognizing one of the things that is particular to you is around traumatic grief in particular.
yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, when you think about people who are coming to you for the first time, or people are just entering, recognizing that they've stepped into that space, unfortunately, because of life circumstances, what do you think is important for us to understand about traumatic grief as it differentiates from other kinds of grief and loss? Or, is there,
Well,
yeah,
I mean, the way that I look at it is sort of this overlap. There's trauma and then there's grief, and there's a place where they intersect. Okay?
exactly. Yeah.
And not all trauma brings grief. If I'm in a car and motor vehicle accident, but no one is hurt, I can still be traumatized, but not have grief.
Yeah.
And if my 98-year-old grandma dies in hospice and it was a quote, good or peaceful
Yeah.
death, then I might have grief, but not trauma.
Yeah.
But my work really focuses on the place where they intersect.
Yeah.
I work with a lot of deaths of children at all ages and from all causes, and suicide and homicide and substance poisoning.
Yeah.
So those are all sort of generally anachronistic losses. They're out of time. They're
Out of order
untimely
losses.
deaths. Right, right. And so, you know, when you lose a spouse at 44, you're not expecting that.
No.
No one expects to lose their spouse at 44. No one expects to lose their 12-year-old to cancer. No one expects to lose their baby at birth. You can feel the tenor is different.
Yes.
So
Exactly.
then, you know, grandma dying at 98 in hospice, good care,
Yes.
peaceful death.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's really the focus of my work, though many of the principles could certainly be applied outside of that.
Yes.
I mean, I'm a research professor at ASU, and so my area is fairly narrow, and that's the area that I really focus on, and the area that we serve here at the Selah Carefarm. So, you know, if someone is experiencing grief and they want help and support because their 90-year-old grandma died a peaceful death, this probably isn't the place for them, but they should get support somewhere. Absolutely. It's just we're so busy, we can't
Yes.
possibly help everyone.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the farm and sort of like what is, if we can maybe imagine a day there, or there are some of the principles of the practices that you've created or the environment that you've created that is particularly attending to and attuning to and accompanying somebody walking through traumatic grief?
Yeah, well, we have 18 acres on the river just outside Sedona, Arizona. It's very lush, very green, lots of water here, which is unusual for Arizona. It's an oasis.
Yes.
It's an oasis in the desert in many ways, metaphorical too. But we have rescue animals here, as animals whose babies have been taken from them, who've been separated from their mothers and fathers and siblings and partners, other animals that with whom they've loved and bonded. We have animals who have been physically tortured, just suffered the worst of physical traumas you can imagine, unimaginable physical trauma. And that has emerged. I think we have 9 studies. Well, we're working on extrapolating data for the 9th study on this model of care. And the one thing that emerges as the most important to people is that not only are there animals here, but their animals are rescued. And so the animals have known loneliness and fear and terror and grief and loss and trauma and all of the same things. And these animals experience complex emotions like jealousy. And, it's very, very interesting. And so the people who come here really love that without any words at all, because words are what get human beings in trouble. For grieving people, the last thing we want to hear is someone else talking wisdom to us, usually, because usually it's just nonsense. It's just trite platitudes. But these animals can connect with these humans at a very, very deep, not a superficial level at all, without any words, completely pre and nonverbal. And it is so powerful. And so we do, like a typical day here. It depends on what people want, but we have yoga teachers and art therapists and sound therapists. And of course, ecotherapy. We're on the river, lots of opportunities to serve others and give back, but also do contemplative work. We have places for energy turned inward, being with grief, and we have places for energy turned outward, doing with grief, to help another and connect to another, in animal care and in caring for a human being who might come, who's earlier on in the process. So it's really a therapeutic community and the central theme is basically it's bereavement. It's all about bereavement and helping people learn how to be with grief. It's a very powerful place. The word Selah is actually a Hebrew word that means the pause. And so it's all about pausing to be with grief. Everything here is designed with intention to bring people into their heart space. And I don't mean that in an esoteric way. I mean it in a very, very tangible, visceral, primal, visceral, our hearts, our emotions, if you want to talk about it. I know emotions technically come from the mind, but they do interact and innervate other parts of our systems, including our gustatory system. Yes. And this bodily interaction, between our physical being and our emotions is incredibly important for people who are grieving. And this place gives them space to exhale into it and to inhale with it. I don't know how to describe it. It's everybody who comes says it's some kind of magic. So
yeah, I love that. Well, my wheels are already spinning. Like, how can I get myself out there? But something, I live now in Southern California in the San Diego area. Okay. Yeah, I'm not far, so we'll talk. But okay. One of the things that, as you were describing that I just want to call out again for those who won't get the chance or not yet get the chance to come to your space, a couple of themes that you talked about there is particularly in the relationship between the rescued animals and maybe the wounded animals and the people, and the way in which to me, that description was really encapsulate sort of the sustained meditation I've had in my work and my life for 25, 30, I don't know, a long time, is around holding space and bearing witness. And a wounded animal isn't there to fix you. They're not there to give you platitudes. They're there to stare in your eyes and allow you to hold the container of everything you need to set down and to move through you. And so I love that you've created this space. And by the way, vice versa, I can imagine that the animals receive that same attending to.
Yes.
Right.
They do.
And that in essence, and we didn't, this is one of the many things that I sort of tagged a little bit, and maybe as we move towards closing today, you could talk a little bit more about it, is that very nature of the pause, because our emotions and the grief we experience is physiological, psychological, I mean, as you said, it's a super highway that goes, up and down and back and forth. But because we're so busy in our lives, we don't even slow down enough to recognize when there's a signal coming to us that needs to be exhaled, that needs to be discharged, that needs to be felt, that needs to be moved. And then we wonder, why am I achy and I'm painy or I'm grumpy or I'm something? And it's because I think we're so busy moving and trying to move to that place of moving on or being fixed, and that it takes real intentional I use arriving practices all the time in my work, or that pause. What do you think scares us about the pause? What don't we get about the pause? How might we show up with the pause in our everyday life?
Well, the pause is where it hurts.
I know.
Because you can disperse the hurt through doing.
Yes.
But the invitation is not to do that, is to allow the doing to come from the being.
Yes.
And to unfold, and not to push or rush it. But we're very busy rushing.
Yeah.
And the very simple and sort of trite metaphor I use in my head, and sometimes when I'm teaching, it's a silly one, but if you break open the chrysalis too early, you don't get a butterfly. You get goo.
Yes.
And
exactly.
And there has to be enough time for that caterpillar to transform, and time and space. And we don't give ourselves that time and space in grief. We don't pause. We want to go right from, this person I love more than anything in the world died, I'm going to start a nonprofit, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, which is all noble and laudable. And also there's a harbinger there. And the harbinger there is, take time, please take time to be with your grief too.
Because grief is going to follow you until you pay attention.
Oh, yes. And it'll look very different in 6 years if you haven't made space for it than it would if you had early on. I mean, I work with someone who lost her child in the early 70s, and
it's
just focus on doing.
Yeah.
And it's just leveling her now. And, the writer Catherine Ann Porter said, the past is never where we think we left it.
I love that so much. And to your point, I use that often, the sort of chrysalis metaphor. And also, I think I understand it to be true, is that everything that the butterfly needs to be is already there. And that I feel like comes full circle back to trusting that intuitive knowing of ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, it's all there. We have all the ingredients there in us, not just in us and in our community and in our ability to reach out and its support, but we have that intuitive knowing. And if we shut it down too quickly, or we get busy being what human doing instead of a human being,
right, then
we dissociate or disconnect from all that good goo.
Yeah.
Sorry to that metaphor that we need, that is going to actually help us transform into this.
To become who we were supposed to be in the
Exactly.
aftermath of this, who we shouldn't have to be, yet here we are.
Exactly.
The thing is, not everyone, and this is the caveat, not everyone has the support from the exogenous system.
Exactly.
And this is why it's so important to try to connect with others, because like there are mentorship programs that try to find someone, even if it's an animal, who can listen to you, who can be with you, and who can help you to be with your grief. Yes. Because it is hard. It is really hard to endure this alone.
Yeah. I don't think we're meant to endure it alone, even though I think there are spaces and times like the 176-mile hike, or the retreats or the meditations, that we do need to be alone. I actually think we need each other.
Especially in acute grief, before we've learned how to trust ourselves with it and built the muscle.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
176 miles, no problem. I got it. I know I've got it. I trust myself. But in early grief, I wouldn't have been able to do that.
No,
I would not have been able to do that. It's such an incredibly lonely experience.
Yeah. And I think then pause is even more important for each of us, to sort of pause in any given moment along this path that we're on, to say, which season of my grief am I in? Am I in the grief where I really need to, I've built the muscle and I can really lean into my own, or am I in the season of my grief where I really need to lean on somebody or to receive that being seen by somebody? But you won't know that unless you pause in some way to
self-awareness, right?
That self-awareness.
That's about really tapping into that self-awareness, which is part of the being with grief practice. The more we practice it, the more aware we become. The more aware we become, the more we can practice. It's a positive feedback loop, really.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Dr. Jo, thank you so much for this extraordinary conversation. Thank you so much for all the beautiful work that you do. Bearing the Unbearable is one of the most exquisite books I've ever read on grief. And you all know that I've read most of them for this show and for my work, really, truly. And I know you offer so much work, including the Carefarm. So listeners, all of that will be linked in the show notes. And if you follow me at Lisa Kefauver MSW, I'll also make sure I put all the content on the socials. But Dr. Jo, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I love getting to talk to a fellow MSW.
Yeah, social workers unite. Thank you, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining, everyone. Ahimsa.